name is Nozi, as Liz just introduced me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for attending. So today we're going to be talking about designing with accessibility in mind. And I just want to start by saying that technology has long been an enabler for people living with disabilities, helping them to consume the world and interact on the internet, and just be more empowered. But a lot of the things that we do find out there are only as good as the UX and the design that lies behind them, as well as the development that lies under them. So, it can exist online, but if someone can't access it because it's poorly designed, then it's pointless because it may as well not exist. So before we continue, I just also want to note that you shouldn't be discouraged as you go through. Once you leave here and you start looking on the internet and you find all sorts of things and you feel like, oh my gosh, where do I begin? It feels like it's just so much. Don't be discouraged by it. There is a lot of stuff out there on the web that will help you and guide you. But the best thing is to just take it in your stride, find people to speak to, and you've already got the tools as designers, as developers. I'm not sure who else is in the audience, but you have it in you to do this and start thinking more inclusively about your work. And the best thing is to just start by switching your perspective, and everything else will flow from there. Okay, so where did my interest start in accessibility? About a year ago, I was creating an analytics tool, and so full of graphs, full of visualizations, and I thought it would be fun because it's the perfect blend between visual design and technical thinking. I don't know what designer wouldn't want to work on an analytics tool. So I went on my way, and I thought the first thing I'm going to do is find colors, because luckily I was starting from scratch. So I thought it would be pretty simple. I would just start with one color. Sorry, I'm just going to stand here. So I thought I would just pick a color, add another color, and I would have two different shades of green. And then I would add more colors, and then I would have an amazing palette to pick from, and then I can immediately start, designing and creating. But it wasn't that easy. So I was sitting, and this one lady came to me, and I was working with her, and she said, "Do you know that if someone was sensitive to color, they wouldn't be able to see the difference between the two colors that you just chose?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I had to start from scratch. But I didn't simply start from scratch. I decided to go out and read a little more and find out what exactly she meant. I've always understood that, everyone sees and experiences slightly differently, but I never appreciated it up until that moment. So, as I started researching, I discovered that that beautiful color palette I had wasn't actually going to work. Because if you're going to squint at it, or look at it using old technology, or maybe you have low vision, you're not going to be able to see the difference between the orange and the red. You'll be able to see the difference between the green and the blue, and all the other pretty shades that I had in my palette. And then again, if you were to look at it, through the eyes of someone who's colorblind, all you're left with is yellow, blue, and gray. So my amazing color palette turned into 4 colors without me realizing it. So I realized that I was designing within my own Umwelt. So Umwelt is a German word that means a self-centered world, directly translated. It just means that you exist in your own reality, and somebody else who exists in the exact same environment has a completely different experience to you. So if you think about it in terms of maybe something we can all connect with, like your childhood experiences. What you experience in your childhood often determines how you interact and interpret the world as an adult. And where you lack in one experience, you will make up for in another experience. So if we translate this to a physical world, where you may lack in maybe sight or hearing, you will make up for in other senses. So as designers, how do we start to use other cues and understand other people's umvelds in order to provide them with the cues that they need to experience the world in the same way? So, this is a term that we hear all the time, disability. And there are many definitions of it in the world. You'll find anything online, both negative and positive. But the one that I want to focus on is the fact that disability is a negative interaction between human and environment. And it's very complex, it's dynamic, it's contested all over the world. But thinking of it in terms of a negative interaction between a human and environment makes you start to realize that you don't have to be physically disabled or permanently disabled in order to have a disability. If something prevents you from interacting with it, you're immediately disabled. So my journey started in the land of visualizations, but it progressed over time, and I started to think, as a designer, how can I create things that someone who may not be able to perceive my pretty colors or the graphs that I've created can still enjoy and partake and consume the content that I've laid out in front of them. And as this research continued, I discovered that there are many different types of disabilities, both invisible and visible. So what you see is not always what you get. And even then, the spectrum is wide. So someone may be living with a disability, and in your experience, it seems very extreme, and you wonder, how do you do it? But in their world, they don't feel disabled at all. And someone else may be living with the exact same disability, and they may perceive themselves to be disabled. And so the important thing to do as a designer is to just speak to the people that you're designing for and find out what their experience is like, because one person's experience will differ very much from the next person's experience. So how do you begin? Start by including people with disabilities in your process. Collaborate with them from the get-go. Include people in user testing and find out how they're using your product, especially if it's something as basic as, say, banking or e-commerce. It's a basic right. Access to finances, access to be able to shop freely without having to rely on anyone else to do it for you. These are the kind of changes we're trying to do as user experience designers. We're trying to influence and affect lives in ways that are meaningful. So consider people's restrictions. How do they engage with your technology, and what's stopping them from engaging with your technology, if anything? And consider their device usage. So when we think of mobile phones, a lot of designers always think of touch targets. So how big is the button? Can someone click on it? That's the first thing we think of. But we never really think of, so when we think of a touch target, we think of a finger, but we never think of someone using a mouse stick. We never think of someone using a screen reader. We never think of someone using a braille display. All these different ways of people accessing your information, we don't think about. And so considering someone with disabilities, a particular disability, will help you start to think of the technology that they use to access your content. And then there's something that Microsoft calls a persona spectrum. So I think we may all understand the word spectrum, a range A to B, A to Z, blue to yellow. But in this instance, a persona spectrum would be how many people are you able to cater for just by thinking of one? So design for one and extend to many. So with disabilities, you could design for someone with a permanent disability, maybe they're an amputee, but in doing so, you're solving for potentially someone who's a new parent with a situational disability. They're walking around with a child in their hand all the time, they're using one hand to interact, they're always busy. How are they going to send a message if they're running around and everything is too small to tap on? If someone has a contextual temporary disability like an arm injury and they've just broken their arm, it's their right arm, they use their left arm, so now they have to use your application with their less strong arm and interact with it. So immediately you start to see how thinking about designing accessibly first can extend to way more people and become a very usable product, make your product become more usable in the long run. And another thing to consider is that, healthcare is getting better and better. People are living longer, which means that there are more older people in the world. That said, your abilities are going to be changing as you get older. Old age is adding to the number of people living with disabilities around the world every single day. And if you think about it in your own instance, in your life, in 40 years, will you be able to use the designs that you're creating today? If the answer is no, then it's something to think about and something to start changing today. So with all that said, disability is contextual. And thinking about it in that manner, thinking about changing abilities, thinking about permanent versus temporary disabilities, thinking about situational disabilities, will just help your product become more usable as you go along. Because accessibility is not always limited to people living with disabilities. Understanding that usability is first, which is what we all do as designers. We create usable products. But designing accessibly means you're making your products more usable by more people in different contexts using different types of technologies or browsers, whatever version it is. They're able to access your information and still perform and participate in the world equally. So how many people are we talking about here? The current world population is sitting at just over 7.6 billion, and 10% of this number is made out of people living with disabilities. So that's 763 million people plus. So if you were to take the United States of America, multiply by 3, and then add Colombia, that's a whole lot of people living with disabilities. 80% of this number is in developing countries, including South Africa. So that's about 610 plus million people living with disabilities in developing countries, including ours. So thinking about it like this, if we just go back to this slide, we have a golden rule when we design. We always say 80-20, right? Design for the 80% and the 20% will fit in, they'll follow. It's a smaller chunk. But if you look at this number, the 20% is a really big number. It's a lot of people that are being excluded from participating in society. And as humans, we've always adapted to our environment. We've always found ways to make things work. But the more technologically advanced we get and the more we start creating and designing spaces, we're able to make our environments adapt to us, but in doing so, we exclude a whole lot of people from participating in what should be a natural adaptation. So with nearly 1 billion people living with disabilities, that's more than 1 million reasons for accessible design. So if you were to start today, where do you begin? So a definition of web accessibility, again, you can find lots of definitions all over, depending on where you read and what you read. But the web accessibility, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are started in the UK, they have 4 principles that they have as guides for people that are creating and designing websites to be accessible. One is perceivable, the next is operable, the other is understandable, and the last is robust. I'm just going to go through these very quickly. So first, when you're designing, ask yourself, is it perceivable? So can someone who has low vision, who is blind, using a screen reader, someone who's deaf, is it available to their senses? Can they access your information? So if they have low vision, what are the other cues that you're providing? If they're blind, are you surfacing information that a screen reader can read to them in order to still access and interact with your content? Is it operable? So if someone is using a mouse stick or tabbing through your keyboard because they're not able to use a mouse or prefer not to use a mouse, are they still able to operate your website? How easy, or your app, how easy is it to complete a task on this said website or app? Then you can ask yourself, is it understandable? So just because you've made it perceivable and you've made it operable doesn't mean that it's understandable. So you need to consider all the language that you use in your site. Is it clear? Does it communicate effectively? Think about the actions that you have. If it's a link out, does someone know that if I click this, I'm leaving this app and I'm going somewhere else? Do they know the connection between the action that they take and the result that they expect? All those things should be clear when you're designing, because if someone doesn't have any other visual cues to rely on your app or your website, they're going to have clear content and structured instructions that make sense and can communicate in ways that they can comprehend so they can complete their tasks. And the last one would be, is it robust? Which is not here, but is it robust? And being robust means that your website or app is compatible with different technologies, different types of devices. So if someone is using old technology, say they're sitting in an internet cafe somewhere and it's really old browser and it's a really old computer, can they still fill out that application form for the SME loan that they're working on? If the answer is no, then it's already a fail. So I just want to go through 4 things that you can keep in mind to help you speed up the process that won't take away from your budget or have you fighting with your business stakeholders immediately. You can immediately start implementing change in whatever areas that you're working. So the first one is contrast. Good contrast is needed on any website, on any app, and for anybody. So if you were to walk out today and use your phone and there's too much sun, you would need some contrast, it would come in handy. So designing with good contrast in mind also means that someone with low vision can still access your information. As designers, I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of the time in mockups, we have these really pretty login forms with nice light gray for the hint text, and it looks so pretty, but if you can't see it, then there's no point. If you can't tell the difference between what is an example text, what is a focus field, and what is a field that is actually being typed in. If you can't see the difference between those 3, then you're not going to know what you're doing, and it's going to frustrate you, and you're going to leave. Find something else, or if you have to go through it, you won't have anything good to say about whatever product you just used. So accessiblecolors.com is a good place to go to check your contrast against the accessibility guidelines. Another thing is color. Never rely on color alone to convey your meaning. So in this instance, it's a simple example. You may have a red outline around one field to show an error and a green one around the other to show success. But if someone is colorblind, all they're going to see is 2 different shades of brown or orange or however it displays in their view. And so adding things like text to communicate and instructions to communicate is just basic usability. But consciously thinking about it means that you'll never forget to do it, and you'll think of ways to do it better each time. And colorblindness.com is a place where you can go, you can upload your screenshots, and it'll check your color contrast. Another thing is tab order. So tab order would be if someone is tabbing through your screen, but also if someone's using a screen reader, you want it to read in a way that's logical for them to understand. So you don't want it to jump from the home button to the buy button, back up to the search button. So indicating tab order is good practice to hand over to your development team, because remember, accessibility will begin in design, but it will always be implemented in development. And so you have to be careful and be conscious of, how you take all the information that you've created and then land it in development, otherwise it falls flat. So Chrome Lens is a nice extension that you can use. If you pull up your inspect tool, it's able to just go through and scan your website, and it will show you which way the tab order is going. So, if it's starting from the top to the bottom, then you know that you have a problem. But you can also consider things like skip navigation, which is important to have. So if someone is going in with a screen reader, or even tabbing through or using a mouse stick, they can skip the navigation and jump straight to the content, because if I go there all the time, I don't want to read every single navigational item, menu item at the top. And the last one here is labeling. So labeling is important because when we design things and when we load them into development, you'll have your search icon as a magnifying glass and maybe your edit icon as a pencil.
You don't want a screen reader to read magnifying glass, or you don't want it to read pencil. It needs to read whatever actionable item is being displayed so that someone can take the right action. So consider things that are descriptive. If you have a back button, maybe go back home, explore things at work and test this with your users. Shopping carts, and this is an e-commerce example, adding to your wish list. If you have variations of something, show that this is blue, this is yellow, this is green. Otherwise, it's just going to appear as tab 1 of 5, which doesn't mean anything to anyone. So also remember that it's possible for something to be accessible but not usable. So I've already mentioned this, but it's good to reiterate. Just because you check all the lists doesn't mean that it's a usable product. At the end of the day, we're all user experience designers and developers creating things, and it's important to know that whatever you design or create may check all the lists, but someone still needs to use it on the other side. And there's this really nice video. I don't know if you guys know the lobby boy from the Grand Budapest Hotel, but it basically describes the lobby boy as being invisible but always in sight. And so it's true for accessible design. If you take your device, many of us don't even know that we've got accessibility features built into our device because we never need them, but they're there. So your accessible design should be the same. How can it be there for someone who actually needs it in that moment? But if you don't need to use it, then it's fine, but it's not ruining your experience in any way. And then we had like a big debate about playing this video because of time, but I'm gonna play it and share it with you. Apple's one of the companies that really prioritizes accessibility, and we often think of things like Siri and Bixby as like gimmicks. They're just trying to sell their product, but we never think about how they make a difference and empower other people in their everyday lives. So this is I get the sound. It's playing from my computer, so it's going to be low.
This is...
Can your computer to output onto the speaker? So let's just go there. Settings, preferences, oopsie. Everything else just like that. Click on settings. Is it that?
Press play. This is the station to rock you, shock you, move you, and groove you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My name is Patrick Lafayette. Don't you ever forget, it's Chris Mix Radio. Patrick with you.
He tunes the guitar as titles appear, like a volcano featuring Patrick Lafayette.
To do something for yourself
Voiceover on Logic Pro X.
is one of the greatest things you could ever do.
Record. Menu 10 items. Count in. Submenu. Metronome setting. Check mark. Allow quick punch and check mark.
He navigates a Logic recording session.
Now, I can express
He
myself.
uses Tap-Tap-C on his iPhone.
Camera. Picture 2 in progress. Picture 1 is citrus printed plastic bottle.
It's a big thing when you're a father and you want to participate.
Picture 3 is garlic powder.
Ha!
Picture 3 is person holding white onions.
His family enters the kitchen.
Don't just make food, but make excellent food. Where I see my wife take her shoes off and say, "Give me some more." And my kids lick their chops and say, "Daddy, that was great." I have so much that I've always wanted to express. I'm like a volcano. I'm like Pele or Mount Etna. I'm about ready to erupt.
He dances to a Logic session as titles appear. Designed for Patrick L. Designed for everyone. an Apple logo appears.
So I thought that was a really nice video when I came across it because it made me realize that, you know, when I think of Siri and I think of assistive technology, I think, oh, it's so far in the future and who's going to use it anyways? I remember when Siri came onto my, computer, I was like, what's the point? Like, why are they putting this here now? But you don't realize that if someone who is relying on home automation or wants to feel empowered, and, they're going to use Siri to activate their lights, to open their door, to get through their house. I mean, this gentleman's using it to cook for his family. It's things that you wouldn't really think of because we're all stuck in our own umwelt, which is not a bad thing. Individual experience are important, but understanding that someone else's experience is different, and if you have the power to make it better, then why not? Just a few examples. Classic example of a curb. It wasn't designed for you, but it works for you. So when you go to a shopping mall or when you're at the airport and you're pushing like lots of luggage, the first thing you look for is that dip in the curb. And it was originally created for people that are using wheelchairs, but we use it all the time now.